You're listening to the Quint podcast.
As urban areas became the epicenters of the COVID-19 pandemic, it sparked several conversations about the frailties of Indian cities. The lack of affordable housing, the lack of adequate social safety nets, public health risks owing to poor sanitation, and most importantly, the vulnerabilities of informal settlements. In this episode, we look at some underlying issues that the pandemic has put forth for sustainable urban planning and the need for effective, affordable housing. Welcome to the Quint's fortnightly podcast, Land of a Billion. This podcast is produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium, or PRRC, which is supported by Omidyar Network India, an investment firm focused on social impact. PRRC is a network of leading think tanks and research organizations working to collaborate and drive policy action in the field of land, housing, and property rights in India. My guests today are Vaidehi Tandal and Sahil Gandhi. Vaidehi was formerly a junior fellow at the IDFC Institute in Mumbai, and Sahil is a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Vaidehi's research lie in the areas of new institutional economics, urban planning, land governance, and political economy. Sahil's research interests are in areas of urbanization in India, land and housing markets, and metropolitan governance. Thank you so much for joining us, Vaidehi and Sahil. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Abhishek. Really looking forward to this.
Yeah, so the goal of our podcast is to understand what it takes to secure land rights for a billion. And in this specific episode, we're trying to apply the lens of adversity, particularly given the context of the pandemic, to understand the underlying governance frameworks in our city, and perhaps what the role that secure land rights can play in aiding our transition towards more robust and resilient urban centers.
If you have to look at what the role cities have been playing historically, you can think of them as centers for economic opportunities and social opportunities, right? And at the same time, because they tend to be dense, because they have a lot of people coming in, usually also people from lower economic backgrounds, you see that there is a demand for a certain type of housing which is not met within cities in India, and that means that they have to fend for themselves, which means a large informalization, looking at different opportunities which are creating opportunities rather for them to sort of live in and survive and make make their livelihoods. And that sort of has led to sort of unplanned informal outcomes, which has been sadly to the detriment of these individuals themselves.
Right. So, given the complexity around land and housing in urban areas, could we start by broadly looking at how the nature of informal housing and service delivery in urban India has led to mixed outcomes of the policies that were announced to tackle the coronavirus pandemic? What kind of outcomes have we seen historically owing to informal urban housing? And is there a way that this can be correlated to the larger urban policy agendas? And perhaps if we can, look at what the shifts have been over time.
This is not the first pandemic that Indian cities have suffered from. What has happened is, of course, the frequency has reduced. So we haven't had a big major crisis of this sort in, say, a century. So we've perhaps forgotten what it has been like to live through pandemics. And the fact that historically there have been such instances means that we really also need to look back and think about what happened then, what was the response of the governments back then and what were the institutions that were created that continue to have an impact even today in terms of how we respond to pandemics in the present state, right? So, for instance, in the early 20th century, we had plague outbreaks, we had cholera outbreaks, we had again the influenza epidemic that really badly affected cities like Bombay. And that led to the creation of the Epidemic Diseases Act, which is currently still evoked when we are dealing with pandemics today. And that also sort of meant that administrations could not turn a blind eye to how a majority of the poor were living in the conditions in which they were living in. Of course, back then, things like the germ theory and modern medicine was not very well known. Back then there was this idea that there may be poisonous gases, or the miasma theory, that could be creating these diseases, and therefore there was a lot of emphasis placed on sanitation, on making sure that housing is well ventilated, there's a lot of sunlight, and that sort of had an impact on how we planned cities. And Bombay saw it. So you saw certain quarters of the erstwhile, cramped colonies being changed and revamped. You saw suburban areas, which are right now, I mean, they're bang in the city, but back then they were considered suburbs. You saw them being well planned out, and better housing and better open spaces being created to sort of avoid this situation where you would have, diseases spreading rapidly. So we've had this response at one point in time in history. And then, of course, we no longer have a colonial government. We, post independence, we didn't pay as much attention to decentralization and urban governance. So it was all basically led by state governments. And then there's also been a gradual neglect because of lack of capacity of governments to think about, public health, public sanitation, and also provision of decent housing for the poor. And it's just the public health aspect of all of this has sort of been neglected, right? You think of informal housing, but you don't think of the public health aspect associated with it. Now, with the pandemic, the current pandemic, what we saw was the slums quickly getting overwhelmed by the disease. So we saw that the areas that were sort of rich or upper middle class areas were able to sort of protect themselves. The kind of containment policies that were put in place, where everyone had to sit in one house and not get out of their localities. All of this is well and good if you have a nice separate bathroom situation in your house and you have plenty of space to socially distance indoors, but that's not the case in our slums. And so, in fact, you probably may increase the risk of people contracting the disease because they were in closed spaces and not well ventilated spaces. And I think that this sort of thinking of like containment it made sense in a certain context, but not in the context of slums. And this was again borne out by recent research findings, right? We had a Zero survey that was done in July, August, and then in October in 3 wards in Mumbai, which found that more than 50% of the population in slums was exposed to the virus. I mean, they had antibodies, and only about 17 to 18% of the non-slum households had exposure to the COVID-19 virus. So that's the kind of disparity we saw because of the policies that were implemented by the government to contain the spread of the disease.
Right. So let's try to understand this a little more. If we look at the policy framework, we see many schemes and initiatives targeting planned affordable public housing, whether it's the central Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana or its offshoots or the various state-level schemes. There seems to be a significant acknowledgement of the gaps. But if we look at the numbers of the actual outcomes of these schemes, a sizable portion of the units built are either left unoccupied or are illegitimately captured by those who are not supposed to be the beneficiaries. So why aren't these schemes and measures able to fill the gaps effectively?
Right, Abhishek, that's a great question. And I think the moment these schemes become more effective, then I believe the problem of public health would reduce, because these housing complexes are quite well planned. It's just that they haven't been that effective. So for example, like in 2016, when we looked at data of Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana and other centrally sponsored schemes, we found that 23% of the houses constructed were vacant. And that was a shocker, because these units were constructed for the poor and they are highly subsidized. So why were these units vacant? So from my reading and research on this topic, I come to a conclusion that there are 2 big reasons why these schemes have been ineffective. The first one is that location matters in cities. And when you have these new public housing units coming up in peripheries, which are really far away from employment locations, then there is going to be this added transportation cost that households have to bear. And households like with very low incomes would not want to bear those transportation costs, and that's one big reason why there is high vacancy of public housing units which come up in the periphery, because there are time costs and transportation costs associated with traveling. Now there was this one paper, the paper is titled Moving to Opportunity, which was published in the American Economic Journal in 2017 by Sharon Bernhardt, Erica Field, and Rohini Pandey, that looked at this topic. They find that public housing was not taken up by the beneficiaries in urban India because the units were coming up in the periphery of cities, which would lead to a loss of social and caste networks for beneficiaries. So the poor really depend on these informal networks when there are income shocks. And when you have these housing units which are away from these networks, then households just don't want to go there. And right now, when we look at the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, like there is a lot of financial outlays, but I haven't come across data on where these units are coming up. Like where exactly is it? I tried to hunt for this data, but I couldn't unfortunately find it. So one thing that would be great that the ministry can do is just start releasing where these new units are coming up. Now, coming to the second reason why we see this ineffectiveness of these schemes is that when we have such a high unmet demand, then the little subsidized supply meant for low income groups will get captured by the middle income households. So the low income households will ultimately sell their property or rent it out to the middle income group. And perhaps the middle income group with political and bureaucratic networks could illegally acquire this housing. So for whom the units are meant for, they actually don't go to them. They go to the other households from the other income groups who are not supposed to be in this housing. So these are broadly the two reasons why we see ineffectiveness of these schemes.
Right, right. And we've already started talking about the rental housing market, and I was curious if there's anything more you'd like to share about the high rates of vacancy. Your recent research found that landlords often intentionally keep their houses out of the rental market, and the number stands at about 1 in 10 urban houses are lying vacant. Could you perhaps explain why this vacancy exists despite a seemingly large demand?
In fact, some of the big cities like Mumbai has 15% of its housing stock vacant. Bangalore has 12%, which is closer to the national average. Gurgaon, which is in the periphery of Delhi, has 26% of its housing vacant. And on one hand, you have tremendous households in slum. On the other hand, you have vacant housing. And so I wanted to enter into this field and do some research on this so that we can bring back some vacant housing into the rental housing market. So at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, I've co-authored this paper with Professor Richard Green, who is at the University of Southern California, and Shauli Patranabis, who is a research assistant at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. And we tried to look at reasons for vacancy. So there are 2-3 reasons for this. One is on the return sides of things. And we know that rental units, when landlords rent them out, the gross rental yields are 3 to 4%, which is extremely low when you compare it to safe investments like fixed deposit. So why would a landlord rent it out if there are risks associated with it? So let me clarify. If there were no risks associated with renting out, then a rational landlord will definitely rent out the property. But in India, there are tremendous risks in renting out properties. Now, these risks come from the legacy of the Rent Control Act and the fact that judiciary takes forever to come up with a verdict. If there is a landlord and a tenant dispute which goes to a court, then it could take 5 to 10 years for that dispute to get resolved. So we tried to do a causal analysis of whether the Rent Control Act has a bearing on vacancy rate, whether ineffective judiciary has a bearing on vacancy rate. And what we find is that states with pro-tenant rent control acts have a higher vacancy rate. And this is not a surprise. Like, everyone knew that. And so if the state has greater protection for a tenant, then a landlord will be apprehensive to rent out the property to a tenant, which makes sense. And the second thing is that if the judiciary is ineffective in resolving a conflict, then in those areas the landlord does not rent out their property to tenants. You see a much higher vacancy in areas where the judiciary is ineffective. So India, where, as compared to other developing countries, in terms of vacancy rate, is actually doing better. So Mexico, in fact, has a vacancy rate of 14%, which is higher than India's vacancy rate. And China has a vacancy rate of 20%. So when you compare India to other developing countries, we are doing pretty well. But when we compare India to developed countries like France, USA, or Canada, the vacancy rates are much higher. And at even lower vacancy rates in these developed countries, as compared to India's vacancy rate, they have introduced several policies to address the vacancy. And one of them is the vacant housing tax. So France, in fact, introduced a vacant housing tax to address vacancy problems. And there was a paper which did a causal relationship between a vacant housing tax and the reduction of vacancy rates in France. And what the paper finds is that the implementation of this tax did lead to a reduction in vacancy rates in France.
I think understanding disputes over land and property has been a recurring part of our conversations on Land of a Billion. So I'm glad we got into that. I'd like to understand some of the more structural issues in terms of governance of Indian cities. Could you perhaps explain with an example or two some of the key issues with urban local governance, which is critical to housing and urban development policies?
Sure. I think this sort of has to be understood within the context of the general federal setup and the nature of decentralization that we have in the country. We know that with the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, the urban local bodies were recognized as legitimate tiers of government. And what the act did was, there was a schedule in the act, the 12th schedule, which listed out all the functions that the urban local bodies had to carry out. So there's a whole roster of this. It includes things like urban planning, land use planning. It also includes slum improvement and upgradation. And it also includes urban poverty alleviation. So there's a lot of these functions that the urban local body is supposed to take care of. But in reality, what's happened is that undertaking these responsibilities requires resources, it requires finances, it requires capacity within the personnel to be able to actually design, think through, implement policies or schemes pertaining to these activities. And here we find that by and large, the task of improving financial capacity as well as resource capacity within urban local bodies has remained unfinished. We have most urban local bodies relying on transfers from the states and transfers from the center for their revenues. Very low capacity for them to raise their own revenues, specifically even property tax, which is supposed to be the source for urban local bodies, has not been utilized to its full potential. And therefore, what has happened is most of the provision with respect to slum improvement, slum upgradation has happened through state government parastatals. So for the case of Maharashtra, we have the MAHADA, which is the Maharashtra Housing and Urban Area Development Authority, which is the sort of body that looks at low income and economically weaker section housing. We even have the MMRDA, which is the Metropolitan Region Development Authority, which is also which is a state government parastatal. So we have all of these taking up this role of slum improvement, of housing provision for the poor, because we simply don't find that capacity in the urban local body. Now, why is this an issue? It's an issue because ultimately, like within the city, you would ideally need to have an empowered local body that is taking up these decisions. Because what has happened is the units are provided by the state or by the center, but ultimately the task of providing drinking water, providing sanitation, taking care of solid waste management, all of that falls on the city. So having an integrated, role that the city can play in both deciding and deciding housing as well as providing amenities would be better, because it would take care of this coordination issue. But we don't see this happening, again, because we've not really thought about empowering urban local bodies in a very serious sense, because we see a reluctance from the state, and then what ends up happening is an over reliance on things like centrally sponsored schemes. So you then have to rely on a smart cities mission or a JNNURM to sort of try and make sure that urban governance is fixed. But the harder problem to fix, which is to have adequate decentralization, goes unresolved.
Mhm. And are there any examples that where you feel like some states or some regions of the country have done better in this regard?
In urban decentralization, unfortunately, there are not many examples, because we only see sort of metropolitan authorities or state government parastatals being involved in slum improvement, slum upgradation. And it's also because of the fact that land is also a state subject. So the state ends up having a lot of say in both sort of government ordinances as well as land laws being passed at the state level. I am not aware of like an example where the city authorities have played a role in slum improvement or in slum upgradation and have done so successfully. It's normally that the state government ends up doing this.
Bedi is right that the cities don't have too much power, but there was this scheme which wasn't again implemented by the city, called the Sites and Services Scheme, which was a World Bank funded scheme which brought in the state government. And that scheme had really good outcomes when it comes to housing. So the underlying premise of that scheme was that there were certain sites in the periphery of the city that were identified, and services were already provided within those land areas. So the pipes were laid out, it was well planned, and those land was then given to beneficiaries. So what happened was that as the incomes of the beneficiaries started increasing, then the household started incrementally building upon that piece of land. Perhaps started off with a smaller unit. As incomes increased further, they strengthened that unit, made it into a 2-story apartment. And you see a very well planned area wherever these sites and services have come up. And it's not only well planned, it's also very mixed. So one good thing that the sites and services did is that it had a mixed housing component. So some of it was given to the richer households, some of it were given to the poorer households, and you see a very well planned area where sites and services came up in Mumbai.
Yes, I think that's a nice example that we should look into. While I was actually preparing for this interview, I also learned that at other forums, you've discussed how urban governance systems suffer from some structural flaws in terms of electoral accountability and financing. Could we discuss that some more? And perhaps if we can touch upon how the GST system has changed the financing side of things? I know that these are perhaps two different questions, but they were sparked by what you were talking about in terms of the structural issues that plague governance in Indian cities.
Sure. So the first part, which is about electoral accountability, we have that only in the fact that we have elections every 5 years to the municipal body. The main authority, though, still lies with the municipal commissioner, and the electoral sort of head, which is, say, the mayor of the city, does not end up having any real powers. And so what ends up happening is, again, the municipal commissioner is not directly elected, and the municipal commissioner is normally appointed by the state government. And so the municipal commissioner is not answerable to the mayor, but is answerable to the state. And state governments don't tend to look at capital cities, especially, if you look at the big cities like Mumbai and so on, they don't tend to, there tends to be little accountability, because they're not elected from urban constituencies, they're elected from rural constituencies, right? And that tends to therefore further dilute any sort of democratic accountability that could have happened where the people actually can question those in power, and if they're not performing well, can actually vote them out. Because yes, you can vote out your mayor and your councillor in the next 5 years, but how much is that going to change the realities? My sense is not much, because ultimately, like, the city is not being run by them, so to speak, right? On your second question about revenues and what effect does GST have on them, so GST, I think, has an effect on, in one particular instance, which is the case of octroi, which is a tax that was levied on goods that enter a city. And some of the states had them. Maharashtra, I think, was the last to sort of disband octroi. And Mumbai, for instance, heavily relied on octroi, because it's a financial capital. So the kind of trades and the kind of goods and services that come in and go out of the city is on we're looking at large volumes. So they were earning a lot through octroi. And I'm not saying that octroi was a great thing in terms of like it was not an efficient tax, but it was an important revenue source. So GST led to the abolishment of octroi, which led to the cities suffering from a massive revenue crunch. And this means that it then relied on property taxes, but it also started heavily relying on things like their FSI premium policy, and so where you can purchase FSI if you're a builder by making a payment to the municipal body.
Right. And just to give some context to our listeners, FSI, or floor space index, in a multi-story building is the ratio of the total built-up area to the size of the plot area it is built on. And the FSI usually indicates how many floors a builder can construct on a particular site, which is determined by the government and varies across states.
So you started looking at these FSI tools, which are actually supposed to be planning tools, right? They're supposed to determine, how, where what can be built, what is the capacity of the area to take on board more built up space and so on. Instead of looking at it as a planning tool, it ended up being a revenue generating tool. So that was like a sort of a distortionary effect of octroi going, or of GST coming.
That sums it up nicely and offers a lot of clarity on how methods of local governance, affordable housing, and resilient societies are all interconnected. Finally, I'd like to ask you a more forward-looking question, and it's something that we ask all our guests. It's, what will it take to secure land rights for 1 billion going forward?
I think going forward, we need to start paying better attention to policy design when we look at both private and public housing. When we have policies in place for private housing, which means, things like how much you can build and what you can build and where you can build, which is what governs private construction within the city, we need to try and make sure that we drastically reduce the time and cost of building. So you need to have permissions and approval processes that are very simplified and easy to get. And also, we need to make sure that whenever we have any policies in place that are going to affect a large section of the city, or a large number of stakeholders, we need to anticipate unintended consequences of policies, and hence try and minimize any sort of distortions that can come about. So what I mean by that is say, things like take the example of the Rent Control Acts, right? They were put in place for a specific objective, which is to protect the tenants, but perhaps better attention should have been paid into what is the incentive structure, what are the disincentives that it has on landlords, and therefore how does that distort the rental market as a whole. So you need to be better at designing them by looking at these unintended consequences. Secondly, we need to also try and rationalize the number of objectives that we expect any policy to satisfy. Because typically when a policy is introduced, you say that, okay, this is going to lead to X, Y, Z, 4 or 5 objectives. And often you're going to lose track of what was the original intent of the policy. And this is exactly what has happened with the FSI premium policies, right? Is it in place because the city needs more revenues? Is it in place because the city needs more housing? That needs to be sort of decided and rationalized at the outset. And the third thing I would say is that when we're designing policies, resource and capacity constraints need to be front and center, because this is what is going to make or break implementation. I mean, I will point to a specific example, which is the MMRDA's rental housing scheme. If you don't know about it, MMRDA, I think sometime in 2012, 14 or something like that, had this rental housing scheme where they got private developers to build housing for them, housing units, and then they were meant to rent these out to the lower income groups or the economically weaker sections. And there was a huge element of implementation, because maintaining rental housing is not easy. You need to make sure you need to fix rents, you need to identify tenants, you need to have a mechanism to collect the rents, you need to make sure that property is maintained, and there's certain amount of money kept for the upkeep of the properties and so on. And this was, there were models that were thought through. There were models that were proposed at the time, but there was no thinking through about, okay, have you identified agencies that would actually come up and third party agencies that could do this or take on this function? And because that didn't come through, ultimately you just ended up converting these rental units into affordable housing units and just sold them off to buyers. So it just happened because there was not much attention paid to implementation and capacity and things like that. I think that's what I would say. For policies to work, we should probably think about these 2 or 3 factors that need to be in place when we're designing policies.
So just coming into where they left is that, and adding to the unintended consequences of policies, is that when you have very stringent regulations in the housing market, you are going to see a lot of informality. And one form of informality that has emerged is that you see construction which is formal looking but not given any permission, which is called unauthorized development. And that happens a lot in major cities. You see that in the periphery of Mumbai, you see that in the periphery of Jaipur, Hyderabad. And it's good that the markets are responding. But however, these buildings are of substandard quality. So during a climate shock, during heavy rainfall, a lot of these buildings break down and fall, and there is tremendous loss of life. And that's not an outcome that an housing market should have, because housing has to be governed and there has to be certain rules that these units have to follow. So one of the adverse effect of really regulated housing market is in a way loss of life. So that's one thing that should be addressed. So you need to relax some of these rules such that unauthorized development does not happen. And on the other hand, as Vedi mentioned, is that the Rent Control Act is one such policy that has led to unintended consequences. And you see that in Mumbai, you see a lot of dilapidated building in South Mumbai, where landlords do not take care of their property, and again during rainfall, these formal buildings which are in dilapidated condition just break down, and there's severe loss of life. Now coming to slums, and the pandemic has shown us that slums bear a big brunt of the spread of the virus, and that the case fatality rate in slum settlements is pretty high. So what should the government do when it comes to slums? And one does not require like new research on this. That the one thing which is a low hanging fruit is that perhaps all slum dwellers should be given property rights, so that once they are given property rights, and the moment they feel that they won't get evicted, then they will invest in their property. They would have toilets within their property. They would connect to water pipelines, and there will be a reduction in crowding at community taps or community toilets. I think this is an obvious thing that one can do.
Thank you so much for joining us on Land of a Billion, Vaidehi and Sahil.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. This was a great conversation.
This was a very eye-opening crash course on the linkages between urban development, service delivery, and resilience of cities. I look forward to bringing you another episode of Land of a Billion in 2 weeks. To make sure you don't miss out on it, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and JioSaavn. Also, we'd love to hear from you about this podcast and what's working for you and what isn't. Do tweet or send us a message at PRRC_India. And if you like our work, do consider sharing it. Take care, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.